that you will appreciate my motives. And now, nothing remains but to convince you of the violence of my affection. I am quite indifferent to the fact that you bring little money with you into our marriage, and promise you that I shall make no ungenerous reference to this after we are married." It was absolutely necessary to interrupt him now. "Sir, you forget I have given no answer. Accept my thanks for the compliment you are paying me, but it is impossible for me to accept your proposal." "Of course I understand," said Mr. Collins, "that young ladies often do not accept a proposal of marriage the first time. I am therefore not at all discouraged, and sincerely hope we shall be married soon." "Sir," cried Elizabeth, "your hope is rather extraordinary after what I've said. I am perfectly serious. You could not make me happy, and I'm convinced I'm the last woman in the world who would make you happy. And I'm sure that if Lady Catherine knew me, she would find me poorly qualified for the situation." "If I knew Lady Catherine thought so," began Mr. Collins, looking very worried, "but I cannot imagine she would disapprove of you, and when I have the honour of seeing her again, I shall certainly tell her how modest, economical, and practical you are." "Indeed, Mr. Collins, all praise of me will be unnecessary. Pay me the compliment of believing what I say. I hope you will be very happy and very rich, but I cannot accept your proposal." She got up and was going to leave the room, but Mr. Collins was speaking to her again. "I am far from accusing you of cruelty in refusing me, as I know it is the custom with elegant ladies in society to refuse a gentleman the first time. I hope to receive a more favourable answer next time I speak to you of marriage." "Really, Mr. Collins," cried Elizabeth with some warmth, "you do puzzle me. I do not know how to express my refusal so that it convinces you." "You must allow me to flatter myself, dear cousin, that you do not intend to refuse me for long. My situation in life, my connections with the de Bourgh family, and my relationship to your own all make my proposal a very suitable one. And you should remember that in spite of your many admirable qualities, it is not certain that you will receive any other offer of marriage, as you have very little money of your own." "Sir, thank you again for the honour you have done me, but to accept your proposal is absolutely impossible. Can I speak plainer than that? Don't think of me as an elegant female, but as a thinking creature speaking the truth from her heart." "You are charming," he cried, "and I'm sure that when both your excellent parents agree, you will accept my proposal." Elizabeth did not reply, but left the room silently, determined to ask her father, if necessary, to make her refusal clear to the self-deceiving Mr. Collins. Mrs. Bennet had been waiting eagerly for the end of the interview, and when she saw Elizabeth leave the room, she hurried in to offer her congratulations to Mr. Collins. He received them with pleasure, adding that he was sure his cousin's refusal was a natural result of her modesty and delicacy of character. "Refusal?" repeated Mrs. Bennet, shocked. "Lizzie refused you? Do not worry, Mr. Collins. I shall speak to her at once. She's a very obstinate, foolish girl, but I'll make her accept you." "Pardon me, madam," cried Mr. Collins, "but if she's really obstinate and foolish, I do not think she would be a suitable wife for a man in my situation." "Sir, you quite misunderstand me," said Mrs. Bennet, alarmed. "She's only obstinate in a matter like this. In everything else she is very agreeable. I'll see Mr. Bennet, and we'll arrange it with her, I'm sure." She did not give him time to reply, but hurried to the library, where she knew she would find her husband. "Oh, Mr. Bennet, we need you urgently. We're all in such confusion. You must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins." Mr. Bennet raised his eyes from his book as she entered, and stared at her with calm unconcern. "I do not have the pleasure of understanding you," he said. "What are you talking about?" "Lizzie declares she won't have him, and if you don't hurry, he'll change his mind and not have her." "So what should I do? It seems a hopeless business." "Speak to her about it yourself. Tell her you insist on her marrying him." "Call her in here. She shall hear my opinion." Mrs. Bennet gladly rang the bell, and the servant brought Elizabeth into the library. "Come here, child," said her father as she appeared. "I've sent for you on a very important matter. I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage, and you have refused." When Elizabeth nodded, he continued, "Very well. Now, your mother insists on your accepting. Isn't that right, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I'll never see her again." "You now have an unhappy choice to make, Elizabeth. From this day on, you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Elizabeth could not help smiling, but Mrs. Bennet, who had been sure her husband supported her, was very disappointed. "What do you mean, Mr. Bennet? You promised me you would insist on her marrying him." "My dear," replied her husband, "I have two small requests to make. First, that you will accept that I know what I promised or did not promise, and secondly, that you will all leave me in peace as soon as possible." That afternoon, Charlotte Lucas came to visit Elizabeth and found the family still in great confusion. The younger girls were quite excited by the news of Mr. Collins' proposal, and Mrs. Bennet was most annoyed with Elizabeth. "Oh, dear Miss Lucas," cried Mrs. Bennet, "can't you persuade Elizabeth to accept Mr. Collins? Nobody else wants to help me. Oh, how ill I feel. And look at Lizzie now. She's so unconcerned. But I tell you, Miss Lizzie, if you go on refusing every offer of marriage like this, you'll never get a husband at all, and I won't be able to provide for you when your father is dead. I warn you now. I told you in the library that I wouldn't speak to you again, and I won't. I have no pleasure in talking to an undutiful child like you. Not that I have much pleasure in talking to anybody with my headaches. Nobody knows how I suffer. But of course, those who do not complain are never pitied." Her daughters listened in silence, aware that any attempt to calm her would only increase her annoyance. Elizabeth, however, was determined not to marry Mr. Collins, and in the end Mrs. Bennet was obliged to accept that fact. When Mr. Collins realised that Elizabeth had meant what she said, his manner towards her became coldly and stiffly polite. His long speeches and flattering compliments were transferred for the rest of the day to kind Charlotte Lucas, who took on herself the trouble of listening to him, for which all the Bennets were very grateful. The next day, a letter was delivered to Jane from Netherfield. Elizabeth saw her sister's expression change as she read it, and when they were alone she asked about it. "It's from Caroline Bingley," said Jane, "and it has surprised me very much. The whole party have left Netherfield and are on their way back to London, probably for the winter. They may not return to Netherfield at all. She says the only thing she sincerely regrets is leaving me behind in Hertfordshire, and promises to write very frequently." Elizabeth did not trust Miss Bingley's apparent affection for Jane. "I really don't think their departure matters very much," she said. "Mr. Bingley won't be kept in London by his sisters. I'm sure he'll be back at Netherfield soon." "But perhaps he prefers to stay in London, where many of his friends are. But I haven't told you everything yet. Let me read you the part which particularly hurts me. Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and we confess we are also eager to see her again. Nobody is more beautiful, elegant, or accomplished than Georgiana Darcy. Louisa and I have great affection for her, and hope one day to call her sister. My brother admires her very much. He will have frequent opportunities of seeing her, and although I am his sister, I must say I think he is most capable of winning any woman's heart. What do you think of this, dear Lizzie? Isn't it clear enough? Caroline doesn't wish or expect me to become her sister-in-law. She's convinced of her brother's indifference towards me, and perhaps because she suspects my feelings for him, she, most kindly, warns me that he's very likely to marry someone else. I have a totally different opinion. Miss Bingley sees her brother is in love with you, while she wants him to marry Miss Darcy. We aren't rich enough or grand enough for them, and she is eager to have a family connection with the Darcys, so that it may be easier for her to marry Mr. Darcy. So she follows her brother to London, hoping to keep him there, and tries to persuade you he doesn't care about you. But of course he's in love with you. I really can't agree with you about Caroline. I think she's incapable of deceiving anyone. But Lizzie, my dear sister, even if she's wrong about her brother, and he does care for me, could I be happy in accepting a man whose sisters and friends all wish him to marry someone else? You must decide for yourself, and if you consider it more important to do what his sisters want than to gain the happiness of being his wife, I certainly advise you to refuse him. How can you say that? Said Jane, smiling a little. You know I wouldn't hesitate, although I'd be sad if they disapproved of me. But oh dear, if he doesn't come back to Netherfield, I'll never have to make the decision. But Elizabeth was sure Mr. Bingley could not be kept away from Jane by his sisters, and soon persuaded Jane to take a more hopeful view of the situation. That day, the Bennets, with Mr. Collins, went to dinner with the Lucas family at Lucas Lodge. Again it was Charlotte who spent most of the evening listening to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth was very relieved, and thanked her friend gratefully for the trouble she was taking. But Charlotte's kindness had a particular aim which Elizabeth was unaware of. Her plan was to encourage Mr. Collins to transfer his attentions to herself. In fact, she was managing so well that when she said good-night to him after dinner, she would have felt sure of success if he had been staying in Hertfordshire for another week. But she did not fully appreciate the fire and independence of his character, which caused him to get up very early the next morning and escape from Longbourn House in a great hurry to reach Lucas Lodge and throw himself at her feet. She did not keep him waiting for an answer, and the happy couple found themselves engaged as quickly as Mr. Collins' long speeches would allow. Charlotte's parents were delighted to agree to the marriage, and Lady Lucas began to work out, with more interest than she had ever felt before, how many more years Mr. Bennet was likely to live. Charlotte herself was quite satisfied. Mr. Collins certainly was neither sensible nor agreeable, but still he would be a husband. She did not think highly of men or of marriage, but she had always intended to marry. Although marriage might not always bring happiness, it was the only honourable way in which a well-educated woman with little income could provide a home for herself. Now 27 and lacking beauty, she felt she was lucky to have found a husband. She knew, however, that Elizabeth, whose friendship she greatly valued, would be astonished and possibly disapproving. So she decided to go to Longbourn House to tell her friend the news herself. Elizabeth was indeed shocked at first, and could not help crying out in surprise. But when Charlotte explained her reasons for accepting Mr. Collins, Elizabeth tried hard to understand. When the rest of the Bennet family heard the news, they were also astonished. Mrs. Bennet was quite horrified, and could not stop complaining bitterly about Charlotte's wickedness, Mr. Collins' stupidity, and Elizabeth's obstinacy. Mr. Bennet was much calmer, only saying he was pleased to discover that Charlotte, whom he used to consider quite sensible, was as foolish as his wife and more foolish than his daughter. That day was Mr. Collins' last at Longbourn, and he left with many speeches of thanks, as well as a promise to return very soon. Mr. Bennet warned him to be careful not to offend his patron by being absent from his duties too often. But Mr. Collins, although extremely grateful for this sign of Mr. Bennet's cousinly affection for him, was naturally eager to return to Hertfordshire to see his future wife. Only 2 weeks later he did in fact come back to stay at Longbourn, but spent most of his time at Lucas Lodge, making arrangements for the wedding. Mrs. Bennet still felt very offended by him, but she was now becoming anxious about something even more important: Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Day after day had passed with no news since the arrival of Caroline Bingley's letter. Elizabeth was now rather worried, and Jane feared the worst. Finally, a second letter arrived from Caroline Bingley, and when Jane read it, she realised that all hope was over. The Bingley family was staying in London for the whole winter, and Georgiana Darcy was a frequent member of their circle. Miss Bingley boasted joyfully of this friendship, and looked forward to her brother's probable marriage to Miss Darcy. Although she was deeply upset, Jane bravely tried to control her feelings. "Do not worry, Lizzie. I shall be able to forget him in a while. I have nothing to complain of, as he made no promises to me. I just thought he cared for me. But I was wrong. Luckily no one is hurt except myself." "My dear Jane," said Elizabeth, "you are too good. You always think the best of everybody. Now I think the worst of most people, and do not see much real value or common sense around me. Mr. Bingley, for example. He may not be intending to hurt you, but misery can be caused by someone being just weak and indecisive. I'm convinced his sisters and his friend Mr. Darcy are trying to influence him against you. Another example is Charlotte. I can't understand how she could agree to marry such a self-important, proud, silly man." "Dear Lizzie," said Jane, "we must respect Charlotte's decision. She may well be happy with Mr. Collins. And as for Mr. Bingley, we shouldn't expect a sociable young man to be so careful of his behaviour. Women often imagine admiration means more than it really does. And men want that to happen." "I prefer to believe that I was mistaken in thinking he cared for me, and that his sisters love him and approve of his wish to marry Miss Darcy. I don't want to think badly of him or his sisters. That would be worse than anything." Elizabeth had to accept Jane's wishes, and from then on, Mr. Bingley's name was seldom mentioned between them. Chapter 6. Elizabeth visits Mr. and Mrs. Collins. The following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came, as usual, to spend Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man. The Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a man who lived by buying and selling could be so well-mannered and agreeable. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was a pleasant, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favourite with her Longbourn nieces, especially the two eldest, who often stayed with her in London. When Mrs. Gardiner had given the present she had brought with her and described the newest fashions, she was obliged to listen to Mrs. Bennet's complaints. "I've suffered greatly since your last visit, sister," cried Mrs. Bennet. "Just imagine! 2 of my daughters were very close to marriage, and then nothing. I do not blame Jane, who would have got Mr. Bingley if she could. But Lizzie, oh, sister, it is hard to think she might have been Mrs. Collins by now if she hadn't been so obstinate. The result is that Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before me. It makes me quite ill to have such a disobedient daughter and such selfish neighbours. But your coming just now is a great comfort to me, and I am very glad to hear what you tell us about long sleeves." Mrs. Gardiner made a suitably sympathetic reply to her sister-in-law, and later that day found the opportunity to discuss the matter in more detail with Elizabeth alone. "I am sorry for Jane," she said kindly, "but Lizzie, these things happen so often. A young man like Mr. Bingley frequently falls in love with a pretty girl, and when chance separates them, he forgets her very quickly." "Yes, aunt," said Elizabeth, "but in this case it was not chance, but the young man's interfering friends who separated Jane and Mr. Bingley. I'm sure he was violently in love with her." "Poor Jane, she's so sensitive. I'm afraid she may not get over it for some time. Now, if it had been you, Lizzie, you would have recovered more quickly by finding humour in the situation. But do you think I could persuade Jane to come back with us to London? Perhaps a change of air would make her feel better." Elizabeth was extremely grateful to her aunt for this kind suggestion, and felt sure Jane would gladly agree. "I hope," added Mrs. Gardiner, "that she will not be influenced by the hope of seeing the young man. We live in such a different part of town that it is very unlikely they will meet, unless he actually comes to see her. And that is quite impossible, because his friend Mr. Darcy would not allow him to visit so unfashionable an address." But despite her protest, Elizabeth secretly thought that Jane might see Bingley in London, and that a meeting would probably reawaken his affection for her. The Gardiners stayed at Longbourn for a week, and Mrs. Bennet made sure there was always some entertainment for her brother and sister-in-law. Whenever there was a dinner party at Longbourn House, some of the officers were always invited.
Mrs. Gardner, who had noticed that Mr. Wickham was a very frequent visitor and that Elizabeth spoke admiringly of him, took care to observe them both. She saw enough to make her a little anxious, and decided to speak to Elizabeth about him when they were alone. "Lizzie," she began, "I can see that you and Mr. Wickham like each other, but I must warn you not to get seriously involved with him. I admit he's a most interesting young man, but sadly he has no fortune. You are a sensible girl and must realise that you would disappoint your father by agreeing to marry a penniless young man." "My dear aunt, do not worry. I'll take care of myself, and Mr. Wickham too. He won't be in love with me if I can prevent it." "Elizabeth, be serious." "I'm sorry, aunt. I'll try again. At present, I'm certainly not in love with him, but he is by far the most agreeable man I've ever met. And if he really loved me, but I would hate to disappoint my father or make any of you unhappy. I cannot promise what I will do, but I will really try to do what I think is wisest. I hope you are satisfied with that." Her aunt replied that she was, and received Elizabeth's thanks for her kind advice. Several days after this, the Gardners returned to London, taking Jane with them. The day of Mr. Collins' wedding soon arrived, and Mrs. Bennet had to watch Charlotte Lucas become Mrs. Collins. Before the bride left Longbourn for Hunsford, however, she asked Elizabeth to come and visit her in her new home as soon as possible. Elizabeth could not refuse, although she did not imagine it would be an enjoyable visit. It was arranged that Elizabeth would accompany Sir William Lucas and Maria, one of his other daughters, on their intended visit to Hunsford in March. A week after Jane's departure, Elizabeth received a letter from her sister saying that she had seen Miss Bingley and hoped to continue their friendship. Elizabeth shook her head over this. She was not surprised to hear from Jane a few weeks later that Caroline Bingley had made no further attempts to communicate with her former dear friend. Elizabeth was saddened to read of Jane's disappointment, but felt more cheerful when she told herself that Jane would no longer be deceived, by the sister at least. All expectation from the brother was now absolutely over. As a punishment for him, she seriously hoped he would soon marry Mr. Darcy's sister, who, according to Wickham, would make him quickly regret what he had thrown away. At about this time, Elizabeth also received a letter from Mrs. Gardner asking about Wickham, and she was able to reply quite honestly that there was no danger of her marrying him. He had transferred his affections to a Miss King, who had recently inherited £10,000. Elizabeth saw exactly what was happening, but her heart had only been slightly touched, and she was able to convince herself that it was quite natural for such an agreeable young man to wish for fortune and independence. January and February passed, and the time for Elizabeth's visit to Mr. and Mrs. Collins approached. She had improved the plan by arranging to spend a night in London at her uncle and aunt's house before continuing the journey into Kent. She was very much looking forward to seeing Jane, who was still staying with the Gardners. The journey seemed long to Elizabeth, because Sir William and Maria had nothing to say worth hearing. But when the coach arrived at the Gardners' house at lunchtime, Elizabeth was delighted to see that her sister looked as healthy and lovely as before. In a private conversation with her aunt later, however, Elizabeth discovered that Jane had been suffering from periods of depression, although she always tried bravely to appear cheerful. The afternoon and evening passed only too quickly, and the next day Elizabeth and the other travellers set off again. When the coach arrived in Hunsford, they were all quite excited to see on one side of the road Lady Catherine's great park, which they had heard so much about. At last, on the other side, they came to the rectory, where they were warmly welcomed by Mr. Collins and Charlotte. Elizabeth was more and more pleased she had come when she found herself so affectionately received. She saw instantly that marriage had not changed her cousin's manners. He insisted on greeting them all with formal politeness and long speeches, and showed them round the house, explaining its many good points in exhausting detail. Elizabeth could not help thinking that perhaps he was speaking particularly to her, as if wishing to make her feel what she had lost in refusing him. But although everything seemed neat and comfortable, she was unable to please him with a sigh of regret. In fact, she wondered how Charlotte could look so cheerful with such a companion. But whenever Mr. Collins said anything of which his wife might be ashamed, which was quite often, Charlotte wisely did not appear to be listening. And when Mr. Collins showed them proudly round his garden, in which he himself enjoyed working, Elizabeth admired the serious way in which Charlotte praised gardening as a most healthy exercise, and admitted encouraging her husband to work outdoors as much as possible. Elizabeth had to confess to herself that, surprisingly, Charlotte really appeared to be happy. When Mr. Collins could be forgotten, the house seemed very pleasant and comfortable, and from Charlotte's evident enjoyment of her home, Elizabeth supposed he must often be forgotten. The visitors had only been in the house for a day, when a message came from Lady Catherine, inviting them all to dinner at Rosings Park the next day. Mr. Collins was delighted and congratulated his guests on their good luck.
"I confess that I might have expected her ladyship to invite us all to drink tea at Rosings on Sunday," he said, "but to invite the whole party to dinner so soon after your arrival too. What a generous and considerate lady she is."
The whole of the rest of that day and the next morning was spent discussing their visit to Rosings. This made Sir William and Maria quite nervous when the moment came to walk across the park and enter the great lady's house. Elizabeth, however, was unimpressed by what she had heard of Lady Catherine, and remained calm. She was interested to see that Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman, who held herself stiffly and proudly, and received her guests with an air of disdain. She spoke loudly and decidedly on every matter, and was clearly convinced of her superiority over other people. Her daughter Anne was completely different, a small, thin, ill-looking lady who spoke very little and only in a whisper. The dinner was very good, and was highly praised by Mr. Collins. His repeated compliments, which Elizabeth thought were embarrassing, appeared to please Lady Catherine very much. After dinner, her ladyship talked continuously, giving her opinions without any fear of contradiction or even comment. She then asked Elizabeth many detailed questions about her education, her sisters, and her father's income. Although Elizabeth considered these questions extremely personal and almost rude, she answered them politely and calmly. At the end of the long evening, the visitors were driven home in Lady Catherine's carriage, while Mr. Collins praised his patron for her elegance, intelligence, and hospitality. This visit was repeated twice a week, but there was little other entertainment in Hunsford. Elizabeth had pleasant conversations with Charlotte, or read books, or walked along a narrow path by Lady Catherine's park, which no one else seemed to use. It was a quiet life, but she was satisfied with it. However, 2 weeks after her arrival in Hunsford, she heard that some visitors were coming to stay at Rosings. Lady Catherine's nephew, Mr. Darcy, was expected soon, accompanied by his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. The next day, the two gentlemen arrived, and came almost immediately to the rectory. Colonel Fitzwilliam was about 30, not handsome, but very gentlemanly, and he talked pleasantly to the ladies. But Mr. Darcy looked as cold and proud as ever, and after greeting Mrs. Collins, spoke only a few stiffly polite words to Elizabeth. She took the opportunity of asking him if he had by any chance seen Jane in London recently, and thought he looked a little confused when he answered that he had not had that pleasure. Soon after that, the two gentlemen returned to Rosings. Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners were very much admired by the ladies, who felt that he would add considerably to the enjoyment of their evenings at Rosings. But it was not until Easter Day that they received an invitation from Lady Catherine, and when they arrived in her sitting-room, it was clear that she was far more interested in her nephews than in her other guests. Colonel Fitzwilliam, however, seemed really glad to see them, and he came at once to sit beside Elizabeth. They talked so agreeably and amusingly together that Mr. Darcy turned his eyes towards them and looked curiously at them several times. When her ladyship also noticed, She called loudly across the room, "Fitzwilliam, what are you talking about with Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." "We're speaking of music, madam," he said, when no longer able to avoid a reply. "Of music? Then please speak to all of us. I must have my share in the conversation if you are speaking of music. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I had ever learned to play, I would have been a great musician. But I often tell young ladies practice is very important. I have told Miss Bennet several times that she will never play really well unless she practices more, and she is very welcome to come to Rosings and practice on the piano in the servants' hall. She won't be in anyone's way there, I can promise her." Mr. Darcy looked a little ashamed of his aunt's insensitive words. Meanwhile, Colonel Fitzwilliam had persuaded Elizabeth to play some music, and she sat down at the piano. But when she had started playing, Mr. Darcy went to stand in front of the piano where he had a good view of her face. At the end of her first piece of music, Elizabeth said, smiling, "You intend to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming to listen to me, but I'm obstinate and won't be frightened." "I don't think you really believe I intend to alarm you. And I've had the pleasure of knowing you long enough to be aware that you occasionally enjoy stating opinions which are not your own." Elizabeth laughed at this picture of herself, and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "Your cousin will teach you not to believe a word I say. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, it is very ungenerous of you to mention all my faults, and perhaps rather foolish too, because I may take my revenge, and tell things about you which your relations will be shocked to hear." "I am not afraid of you," said Darcy, smiling. "But let me hear your accusation," cried Colonel Fitzwilliam. "I'd like to hear how he behaves among strangers." "Well, prepare yourself for something very dreadful. The first time I ever saw him was at a ball in Hertfordshire, and at this ball, what do you think he did? He danced only 4 dances. I'm sorry to cause you pain, but that is what happened. He danced only 4 dances, although gentlemen were scarce, and to my certain knowledge, more than one young lady was sitting down waiting for a partner. Mr. Darcy, you must admit it." "I had not, at that time, the honour of knowing anybody at the ball apart from my own group of friends. I should perhaps have asked to be introduced, but I do not like to recommend myself to strangers. I do not find it easy to talk to people I don't know." "You don't want to take the trouble to do it, Darcy, that's why," said Colonel Fitzwilliam. "I cannot play this piano as well as some other women," said Elizabeth, "but I've always assumed it is my own fault, because I don't take the trouble to practice. I know that I am capable of playing as well as anyone." Darcy smiled and said, "You are perfectly right. You have spent your time in a much better way. No one who hears you could imagine any possible improvement. We neither of us perform to strangers." Just then Lady Catherine interrupted them to comment on Elizabeth's playing. "Miss Bennet would play quite well if she had a London teacher. Of course, Anne would have been a delightful performer if her health had allowed her to learn." Elizabeth looked at Darcy to see his reaction to Anne de Bourgh's name. But neither at that moment nor at any other could she observe any sign of love or even interest in his cousin. Lady Catherine continued to give Miss Bennet advice on her playing, but at the request of the gentleman, Elizabeth stayed at the piano for the rest of the evening. Chapter 7. Darcy proposes marriage. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning writing to Jane, while Mrs. Collins and Maria were shopping in the village. She heard the doorbell ring, and knew that meant a visitor had arrived, but she was greatly surprised when Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, was shown into the room. He seemed astonished too on finding her alone. "I apologise for disturbing you, Miss Bennet. I understood that all the ladies were at home."
"Please don't apologise, Mr. Darcy. I hope Lady Catherine and her daughter are well."
"Very well, thank you." He said no more. As he seemed in danger of sinking into total silence, Elizabeth had to think of something to say. She remarked, "How very suddenly you all left Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. I hope Mr. Bingley and his sisters were well when you left London?" "Perfectly, thank you." That was all the answer he gave. "I think I have heard that Mr. Bingley has not much idea of ever returning to Netherfield again." "It is probable that he will spend very little of his time there in future. He has many friends elsewhere." Elizabeth did not want to talk any longer about Mr. Bingley, and determined to leave the conversation to Mr. Darcy, she remained silent. He understood, and soon began to speak again. "Mr. Collins appears very fortunate in his choice of a wife." "Yes, indeed. She is one of the few sensible women who would have accepted him, although I'm not sure I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the wisest thing she ever did. She seems perfectly happy, however, and financially speaking, it's a good marriage." "It must be very agreeable to her to be such a short distance from her own family and friends." "A short distance, you say? It is nearly 80 kilometres. "And what is that? Little more than half a day's journey on a good road. Yes, I call it a very short distance." "I would never have said Mrs. Collins lived near her family," cried Elizabeth. "That shows how much you are attached to Hertfordshire. Anywhere outside the Longbourn area would, I suppose, seem far away to you." As he spoke, he smiled a little. Perhaps he supposed she was thinking of Jane and Netherfield, thought Elizabeth, and she blushed. "Whether the distance seems long or short depends on many circumstances. If the family's income is large enough to pay for frequent journeys, then distance is not a problem. But Mr. and Mrs. Collins will not be able to afford to travel very often, despite their comfortable income. I'm certain my friend does not consider Hunsford near her family." Mr. Darcy moved his chair a little towards her and said, "You cannot have a right to such a very strong local attachment. You haven't spent your whole life at Longbourn, I am sure." Elizabeth looked surprised. Experiencing a change of feeling, the gentleman moved his chair away again, took a newspaper from the table, and glancing at it said in a colder voice, "Are you pleased with Kent?" They discussed Kent calmly and politely for a few minutes, and were then interrupted by Charlotte and Maria, who had returned from the village. Mr. Darcy sat a little while longer without saying much to anybody, and then went away.
"What can be the meaning of this?" said Charlotte as soon as he had gone. "My dear Lizzie, he must be in love with you, or he would never have visited us in this familiar way."
But when Elizabeth described his silence, that did not seem likely, even to hopeful Charlotte, and they could only suppose that he had nothing better to do. In fact, from now on, both Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam called regularly at the rectory. It was obvious that Colonel Fitzwilliam came because he enjoyed talking to the ladies, and Elizabeth was reminded by her own satisfaction in being with him, as well as by his evident admiration of her former favourite, Wickham. But it was more difficult to understand why Mr. Darcy came. He did not often speak, and seldom appeared interested in the conversation. Even Charlotte, who observed Mr. Darcy closely, was not sure whether he admired Elizabeth or not, and began to hope that perhaps her friend might marry Colonel Fitzwilliam instead. When she took her daily walk along the path bordering the park, Elizabeth met Mr. Darcy unexpectedly more than once. This was the more surprising because she was careful to inform him that it was her favourite walk, so that he could avoid meeting her. It was also strange that although he could just have greeted her and walked on, he always thought it necessary to turn back and walk with her. She could not quite understand him. But one day, as she was walking, she met Colonel Fitzwilliam, not Mr. Darcy, and greeted him with a smile. They walked back to the rectory together. "Are you leaving Kent this Sunday?" she asked. "Yes, if Darcy doesn't put it off again." "He is fortunate to be able to arrange things as he likes." "Well, we all want to do that," replied Colonel Fitzwilliam. "But he is used to doing what he likes because he is rich, and many others are poor. I, for example. I'm a younger son, you know, and won't inherit my father's fortune, so I shall never be rich or independent like Darcy." "Now, seriously, you cannot call yourself poor. When have you ever suffered because of lack of money?" "Well, perhaps I haven't really suffered much yet, but there are difficulties. A younger son doesn't have a free choice when marrying. He cannot afford to marry a girl with no fortune." Elizabeth blushed, thinking that he might mean her, and began to talk of something else. She asked him about Darcy's sister, and mentioned that the Bingley sisters liked her very much. "Bingley? Yes, I know them. Their brother is very pleasant. A great friend of Darcy's," answered Colonel Fitzwilliam. "Oh, yes. Mr. Darcy is extremely kind to Mr. Bingley and takes very good care of him," said Elizabeth dryly. "Yes, I believe Darcy does take care of Bingley. I'm thinking of a recent situation which Darcy was telling me about on the journey here. He was congratulating himself on having saved a friend from a most foolish marriage. Of course, I'm not sure the friend was Bingley, as Darcy didn't mention the name." "Did Mr. Darcy give you his reasons for interfering?" "I understood that there were some very strong objections to the lady." Elizabeth could not speak for a moment. When she was able to control her anger, she changed the conversation. As soon as they reached the rectory, she said goodbye to Colonel Fitzwilliam and went straight upstairs to her room. At last she could think without interruption about what he had told her. Bingley must have been the friend to whom Darcy was referring. She had always assumed that Darcy was involved in the plan to separate Jane and Bingley, but now it appeared that he, not Miss Bingley, was the main cause of all that Jane had suffered and still continued to suffer. The very strong objections to the lady probably consisted of having one uncle who was a country lawyer and another who was in business in London. There could be no possible objections to Jane herself, as she was intelligent, beautiful and charming. Nor could anyone object to Mr. Bennet as a father-in-law. When Elizabeth thought of her mother, she felt a little less confident. She was still convinced, however, that Mr. Darcy was interested in high-born connections rather than character or common sense. It was this, the worst kind of pride, which had destroyed for a while every hope of happiness for the most affectionate, generous heart in the world. Thinking about all this made Elizabeth so upset and unhappy that she soon had a headache. It grew so much worse in the evening, and she was so unwilling to see Mr. Darcy that she decided not to go to Rosings that evening with Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Instead, she stayed in the rectory sitting-room, rereading Jane's recent letters from London. She was saddened to discover that although Jane never complained or referred to the past, in almost every line there was a lack of cheerfulness which Elizabeth had not noticed the first time, and which now made her rather anxious. She was relieved to think that Darcy would be leaving Rosings in 2 days' time, and she herself would be with Jane in less than 2 weeks. Colonel Fitzwilliam would also be leaving with Darcy, but he had made it clear that he had no intention of proposing to her, so she did not intend to be unhappy about him. Just then she heard the doorbell, and wondered if it might be Colonel Fitzwilliam come to inquire about her health. But to her astonishment, she saw Mr. Darcy walk into the room. In a hurried manner, he began to ask how she was feeling. She answered him with cold politeness. He sat down for a few moments, and then, getting up, walked about the room. Elizabeth was surprised, but said nothing. After a silence of several minutes, he came towards her, with none of his usual calmness, and said, "In vain have I struggled. It is no good. I cannot conquer my feelings. You must allow me to tell you how warmly I admire and love you." Elizabeth stared, blushed, doubted, and was silent. He considered this sufficient encouragement, and confessed all that he felt and had felt for a long time for her. He expressed himself well, but it was not only of love that he spoke. He also talked of his pride, and his sense of her social inferiority, which had made him struggle against his feelings for so long. In spite of her dislike for him, Elizabeth appreciated what a compliment such a man's affection was, and was at first sorry for the pain he was about to receive. But soon, as she heard his references to her inferior position, she lost all pity and became very angry. She waited patiently, however, until he had finished. He ended by describing the strength of his love for her, which, in spite of all his attempts, he had been unable to conquer with arguments of reason and common sense. And finally, he asked for her hand in marriage. She could see that he had no doubt of a favourable answer, which only made her angrier. "I believe society considers it correct in cases like this," she replied, "to express grateful thanks. So if I could feel grateful, I would now thank you. But I cannot. I have never wanted your good opinion of me, and I cannot accept it. I'm sorry to hurt anyone, but it has not been done deliberately, and I hope the pain will not last long. The pride, which you tell me has long prevented the expression of your affection, can have little difficulty in conquering your feelings after this explanation." Mr. Darcy, whose eyes were fixed on her face, was both angry and surprised by her words. His face went pale, and he was clearly struggling to control himself. There was a dreadful pause, and then he spoke in a voice of forced calmness. "And this is all the reply I am to have the honour of expecting? I might, perhaps, wish to be informed why, with so little attempt at politeness, I am rejected." "I might as well ask why, with so evident a wish to offend and insult me, you chose to tell me that you loved me against your reason, and even against your character. But even if my own feelings towards you had been favourable, do you think anything could tempt me to accept the man who has destroyed, perhaps for ever, the happiness of a most dear sister?" As she said this, Mr. Darcy changed colour, but he listened without trying to interrupt her as she continued. "I have every reason in the world to think badly of you. Can you deny that you were the cause of Jane's separation from Mr. Bingley, and of her unhappiness? Can you deny it?" "I have no wish to deny that I did everything I could to separate them, and that I am delighted with my success. Towards my friend I have been kinder than to myself." Elizabeth treated this last remark with disdain, but its meaning did not escape her. "But it is not only because of Jane that I dislike you. My opinion of you was decided long ago. I heard all about your character from Mr. Wickham. Now, what can you have to say on this matter? How can you defend yourself?" "You take an eager interest in that gentleman," said Darcy, less calmly than before. The colour was rising in his face. "Who can help feeling an interest in him when we hear of the unfortunate life he has had?" "Unfortunate!" repeated Darcy contemptuously. "Yes, unfortunate indeed." "And it was your fault," cried Elizabeth with energy. "You took away his chance of a comfortable income and a good position, which you knew had been intended for him. You have left him poor and dependent and disappointed. You have done all this, and you can still treat the mention of his name with contempt."
"And this," cried Darcy, as he walked with quick steps across the room, "is your opinion of me. Thank you for explaining it so fully. But perhaps you might not have considered these offences of mine if your pride had not been hurt by my honest confession of my reasons for not proposing to you earlier. Perhaps I should have hidden my struggles and flattered you by pretending I had every reason to love you. But I hate disguise of any sort. Nor am I ashamed of my feelings of pride, which are very natural. Could you expect me to delight in the inferiority of your family compared to mine?"
Elizabeth felt herself growing more angry every moment. "Mr. Darcy, you could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. The moment I first met you, I noticed your pride, your sense of superiority, and your selfish disdain for the feelings of others. Later events strengthened my dislike for you. You are the last man in the world whom I could ever be persuaded to marry."
"You have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly understand your feelings. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness."
With these words, he hurried out of the room and the house. Elizabeth felt so weak that she sat down and cried for half an hour. She was so astonished to have received a proposal from Mr. Darcy. His affection for her must indeed have been strong to conquer all the objections he had to her family and position, objections which had made him prevent his friend marrying her sister. But his terrible pride, his shameless confession of what he had done to separate Jane and Bingley, and his cruelty towards Wickham, soon removed any pity she might have felt for him. Chapter 8. Elizabeth learns more about Darcy and Wickham. The next morning, Elizabeth had still not recovered from the surprise of Darcy's proposal to her. Feeling in need of exercise and fresh air, she decided to have a walk. In order to avoid meeting Mr. Darcy, she kept away from her favourite path, but could not resist walking a little way into Lady Catherine's park. There she was astonished to see Darcy himself approaching her and calling her name.
"I have been walking some time in the hope of meeting you," he said. "Will you do me the honour of reading this letter?"
And handing her an envelope, he bowed slightly and walked quickly away. With no expectation of pleasure, but with the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter and began to read it as she continued her walk alone. "Do not be alarmed, madam, that I shall repeat the offer which so disgusted you last night. I have no intention of mentioning again wishes which, for the happiness of both of us, cannot be too soon forgotten. I would not have written, but justice requires my character to be defended. You accused me last night of two very different offences. The first was that I had separated Mr. Bingley from your sister, in spite of their mutual affection, and the second was that I had destroyed Mr. Wickham's chance of future wealth and happiness, in spite of my father's honourable promises to him. I hope that you will no longer blame me for either of these offences when you have read the explanation which follows. If I am forced to describe feelings which offend you, I can only say I am sorry." I had not been long in Hertfordshire before I noticed that Bingley preferred your elder sister Jane to any other young woman, but I had often seen him in love before, and it wasn't until the Netherfield ball that I realised how serious his attachment was. I was careful to observe your sister closely, and as her manners and appearance were as pleasant and cheerful as ever, I remained convinced that she did not feel strongly about him. I was perhaps deceived by her calmness, and in that case your anger has not been unreasonable. but I sincerely believed that her heart had not been touched. I objected to Bingley's possible marriage to her, not only for those reasons of social inferiority that I mentioned to you last night, but also for reasons which in my case I had tried to forget, but which I must state now. The behaviour that evening of your mother, your 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even your father, was so lacking in social correctness that I made up my mind to save my friend from what I considered would be a most unhappy marriage. If you are upset by my description of your family's faults, it may comfort you to consider that you and your elder sister have avoided any share of blame and deserve nothing but honourable praise for your behaviour. To continue, when I was in London, with the help of Bingley's sisters, who shared my opinion, I explained to him the disadvantages of marriage to your sister. This alone would not have been enough to prevent the marriage, if I had not also been able to convince him of your sister's indifference to him. Then it was easy to persuade him not to return to Hertfordshire. I do regret one thing, however. Miss Bingley and I both knew that your sister was in London, but we hid the fact from Bingley. In this, I consider, I was less than honest, but I have no other apology to offer. Your other, more serious accusation refers to Mr. Wickham. Here again I may cause you pain, only you can tell how much. In order to show you his real character, I must explain the whole of his connection with my family. His late father worked for mine for many years, helping to look after the Pemberley farms. His son, George Wickham, received much kindness from my father, who paid for him to go to school and to university. My father hoped the young man would enter the church. If he became a priest, I was to give him the post of rector in a village near Pemberley when it became vacant. But even before my father died, I had discovered Wickham's weakness of character and lack of morals. After my father's death, Wickham wrote to inform me that he did not intend to enter the church, and asked for an amount of money instead of the post of rector. I knew that with his character faults he ought not to become a priest, and I therefore agreed at once. The business was soon arranged. He resigned all claim to the church post and accepted £3,000 instead. I hoped that I would not see him or hear from him again. But 3 years later, he wrote again, this time to ask for the rector's post, informing me that his money had all gone and his situation was desperate. You will hardly blame me for refusing. Since then, he has doubtless been violent in accusing me of injustice to all who will listen to him. There is one more circumstance which I would like to forget myself, but which I must now mention. I rely on your keeping this confidential. A year ago, I sent my sister, who is 10 years younger than I am, on holiday to Ramsgate in Kent, in the care of a female companion. Unfortunately, there was an understanding between this woman and Mr. Wickham, who also went to Ramsgate. With her help and encouragement, he spent a great deal of time with Georgiana, and flattered her so much that she believed she was in love, and agreed to elope with him. She was only 15 at the time, and I am glad to say that she confessed everything to me immediately when I arrived unexpectedly in Ramsgate just before their planned elopement. Naturally, I dismissed the companion, and wrote to Wickham, who left the place at once. He was doubtless most interested in my sister's fortune, which is £30,000, but I cannot help supposing that he was also eager to revenge himself on me. I hope you will now clear me of all blame in this matter. If, madam, you doubt the truthfulness of my description of these circumstances, I suggest you speak to Colonel Fitzwilliam. As my cousin and close friend, he knows every detail of these events and will be happy to support what I say. I will only add, may God be with you. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Elizabeth experienced a variety of emotions as she read the letter. She was astonished to discover that Darcy was capable of any sort of apology. It was with a strong prejudice against anything he might say that she began reading his explanation of what had happened at Netherfield, and at first she was too angry with him to treat him with justice. But when she went on to read his description of his relationship with Wickham, she hesitated. It was so very different from Wickham's story, which she would have preferred to believe. But after a few moments' thought, she realized that Darcy's statement was much more likely to be true. She began to remember several things about Wickham which now appeared strange to her. On the first evening she had met him, he had told the whole story about his lost fortune and the Darcy family to her, a total stranger. Then he had boasted of having no fear of Darcy, but had avoided the Netherfield ball the very next week. In addition, he had waited until the Bingleys and Darcy had left Netherfield before making his accusations public. She reminded herself that no one in Hertfordshire knew anything about Wickham's past, so it was quite possible that he lacked morals, as Darcy said. She had to admit that Darcy himself, though horribly proud, had always shown himself to be a gentleman. Finally, Darcy would certainly not have dared to refer her to Colonel Fitzwilliam if he were not certain that his cousin could prove these statements. She became absolutely ashamed of herself. "How badly I have behaved!" she cried. "How prejudiced I have been! I, who have always been so proud of my ability to judge people. That pride has led me blindly into making a stupid mistake. Flattered by Wickham's interest and offended by Darcy's coolness, I have misjudged both of them. Till this moment, I never knew myself." She reread what Darcy had to say about Jane, and this time was forced to admit that Jane had displayed few outward signs of her feelings for Bingley. Charlotte had even commented on it. Then, when Elizabeth looked again at Darcy's comments on her family's behaviour, her sense of shame was very great, and she could not deny the justice of his words. Feeling more miserable than she had ever felt before, she slowly returned to the rectory, where she had difficulty in maintaining a cheerful appearance. Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam left Rosings the next day, and were sadly missed by their aunt, who now had so little entertainment that she invited the Collinses and their visitors several times that week. As Elizabeth only had a few days left before the end of her visit, she thought it fortunate that most of her time was occupied. When she had a moment to herself, it was a great relief to walk outside in the garden or the park, alone with her thoughts. She soon knew Mr. Darcy's letter by heart. Although she was still angry with him for the proud, overconfident way in which he had proposed, her anger turned against herself when she considered how unjustly she had criticised and accused him. She respected his character and felt